Today we have another 3 cases that are a bit on the shorter side, all compiled into one video. We'll be looking into the Blockheads of Connecticut, which in the past was said to be one of the most famous cases in the state. And then there's the little known encounter from the UK in which a group of young adults witnessed a UFO and then what many would later call a fire demon. And then we'll be ending with a very strange encounter of a ghostly alien hovering up an army barracks staircase. With all that said, let's go ahead and hop into the first topic. Old Saybrook Blockheads. Probably the best remembered of these 3 cases, the story of the Blockheads was once known across Connecticut. Although not quite as well known now, this story continues to live on just due to the strangeness of the aliens seen by the witness. Although this case was once very well known, the original report from the Civilian Saucer Intelligence of New York no longer exists. But after searching the Internet Archive, it is possible to at least find a text from this case on a no longer functional Connecticut MUFON website. It starts by stating the list of different types of little men keeps growing, with a very strange report from an unusually reliable source. A longtime resident of Saybrook and retired teacher, Miss Mary Starr, held 2 degrees from Yale University. Although many of the residents in this area only spent their summers here, Starr was here all year round, and was often the only person in the neighborhood living there during the winter. And even if somebody else was around, the other houses were a ways away as they were close to the sea and the ground was quite marshy. But it was during one of these isolated winter evenings that something very strange would take place right in front of Mary's eyes. Around 2 or 3 a.m. on December 16th, she was sound asleep when she would be woken up by a loud sound and lights passing through her north-facing bedroom window. Getting out of bed, she walked over to the window, looking out to see a huge 20 to 30 foot long, dark gray or black, oval-shaped craft with brightly lit square portholes floating just 10 feet away from her house. At first she thought this was possibly a military aircraft losing altitude and about to crash into her yard, saying, "I went to bed early, around 10 o'clock. Sometime between 2 and 3 in the morning, I was awakened by a bright light in my room. I looked out the window and there was what I first thought was a crippled airplane in my back garden. But when I got my eyes really open, I saw it was a cigar-shaped object, brightly lit and with square portholes, hovering just above my clothesline. I could see men inside." She would also note that she couldn't see any wings, fins, or any other external structures on the craft. Through the lit-up window, she could see 2 figures passing by each other, appearing to be walking in opposite directions. It looked like each had their right arm raised up as well, but no hands could be seen on either of the strange figures. They looked to be wearing some kind of jackets that were flared out at the bottom, but the lower half was below the window and couldn't be seen. Mary, still thinking that this must be some kind of plane, thought that these figures may have been stewards carrying trays. As she looked closer though, it was obvious that their heads were very strange, both in appearance and shape. They were square, rectangular in shape, reddish-orange in color, and looked to have some kind of bright light bulb in the center, telling the reporter that she thought it may have just been some kind of bizarre helmet. From the left side, a third figure stepped into view. In an attempt to get a better look at it, she began to lean out the window. It was then that they possibly saw her, as the portholes all faded and the entire craft began to glow brilliantly. Then, from the side nearest to her, she could see a small antenna-like object rising up about 6 inches, before it started to oscillate and spark. Mary thought this may have been a way to signal directions, but that was her only idea. For about 5 minutes, the strange object glowed and sparked until the antenna retracted back down, and the craft slowly began to move from the motionless position. She expected it to keep going straight across her yard towards her tool shed, but it suddenly reversed and flew right in the same direction it had came from. And then, before flying into her spruce tree, it suddenly made a sharp right turn, with Mary saying they had a good navigator. At this point, the ship stopped glowing and returned to the dull gray color it had been before. The portholes still weren't visible, but there did seem to be a row of small circular lights outlining the entire rim. The oval craft flew low, dipping with the contours and depressions in the ground near her garden. She could now see that it appeared to be fairly thin, describing it as more of a saucer than an egg shape. As it flew over the marsh, it suddenly tilted steeply upwards before it shot off at the speed of a jet. but she added that the whole event was completely silent. Thinking back, she would realize that she had not seen anything such as instruments or equipment inside the craft either, only the strange figures. She then began to consider the dimensions of the object and the entities inside, comparing the clothesline it flew by, saying, "I could see that the object, was so shallow that the men could not have been more than 3.5 or 4 feet tall." She would also add that although she didn't see it until it was near her window, she believed that it must have flown in from the nearby Sound Island, because she had heard of UFO reports from there recently. Just 3 weeks before this, a local paper would publish a report by a hotel caretaker that claimed to have seen 40 reddish oblong objects brighter than stars flying from south to north before disappearing into the clouds. Miss Starr knew that there wouldn't be anyone else in the neighborhood to corroborate her story, so she held on to it, not telling anyone for over 9 months. One day in September 1958, she decided to report it to the National Investigation Committee on Aerial Phenomenon. They would send out 2 well-known researchers, Richard Hall and Isabel Davis, to interview her and investigate the case. And in the end, neither one of them could find any reason to dismiss her story. Because of her background, they didn't believe she would have any reason to invent or embellish a tale like this, and ultimately put it in the authentic category of cases. Hall would actually compare this to a few other cases as well, and although they happened a few years earlier, he thought that they were all pretty similar and could have even been the same craft. The first would be a report from August 1952 made by William Squires, who was a musician and staff member of the KOAM radio station in Pittsburgh, Kansas. He would see an oval object about 75 feet long, 45 feet wide, and 25 feet high. It was hovering over a field next to the highway, appearing to slowly rock back and forth in place. The body of the craft was a dull aluminum color, with several rectangular windows extending from the very top to the middle rim, which all emitted a bluish light fluctuating in brightness. William would say, "I definitely saw a human being through the window." But he couldn't make out much detail. He stopped his car and got out, deciding to approach the craft on foot. When he was about 200 feet away, he started to hear a steady throbbing sound before the craft suddenly started to rise upwards. It blew around the vegetation beneath it before it flew off into the air and out of sight, making a sound like a, quote, "convoy of 100 quail taking off." The second would also be a case from August 1952, when a Miss Susan Knight, a young housewife and mother, saw a UFO with an occupant on board at a close distance. Before she could take a look inside, it changed from a glowing red color to a dull silver, with Susan saying it was, quote, "like the door of an old pot-bellied stove." Thinking of the sparks in the square windows, another event from October 27th, 1952 would come to Hall's mind. That being the UFO landing at the Marignane Airport in France. At 2 a.m. that night, Customs Officer Gabriel Gauchesnard observed a cigar-shaped flying object land briefly on the airfield with a dull thud. It was a dark color, but had 4 windows that were brightly lit up. As the witnesses began to approach it, the craft suddenly took off with a swish sound and a shower of sparks. Although the entities are either not seen or a bit different in these other cases, many believe them all to be sightings of the same craft. And even though we haven't seen creatures exactly like the Blockheads in more recent encounters, the odd way they were described continues to interest and inspire people to this day and can be seen in a variety of places around the internet. The Felixstowe Fire Demon. When we were younger, we probably all had one of those nights that ended up more memorable and exciting than we ever imagined it would be. However, on this fun night, 3 young adults' lives would forever be changed when they witnessed something very odd and frightening. It was September 20th, 1965, and a group of British young adults were out enjoying the fall evening out in Felixstowe. Felixstowe is a port town located on the North Sea coast of England, and it offered a number of sights for the group to see while driving. 25-year-old Jeffrey Maskey and his passengers, Mavid Fordyce and Michael Johnson, took Walden Avenue around 10:30 and they began to head towards Essex. But about halfway there, they decided to pull over the curb and hang out on the tree-lined street for a while. They were all having a lively conversation with each other when Johnson suddenly opened the door and walked away into the darkness without saying a word to the others. Thinking that he must have just had to go to the bathroom, the other two just shrugged it all off at first. But then just a couple of moments later, they began to hear an eerie, high-pitched humming sound. Fordyce was starting to get anxious as the sound began to overwhelm them. But Maskey was actually getting annoyed with it all and began to lean out the window in search of the source. Soon after, he would spot a very strange glowing oval shape floating in the sky about 90 feet above the car. The craft itself looked to only be about 6 feet wide, but it emitted a strange orange light bright enough to light up the whole area around them. After just a few moments, the object started to fly away and then disappeared behind the trees very quickly. After this, everything once again grew quiet as Maskey and Fordyce stared at each other in shock and confusion. It was then that the two realized that Johnson had never came back to the car, and were even wondering if he may not be alone out there anymore. The two were quite reluctant to get out of the car and walk into the dark woods at this point, so they began to shout his name from the open windows. Maskey even threw the car in reverse and drove back a little ways in search of Johnson, but they weren't having any luck. But then out of nowhere, Johnson emerged from the brush and staggered into the middle of the road, all while holding the back of his neck. Maskey thought that Johnson was just playing a joke on them at first, but right then he collapsed onto the pavement. The two in the car were still quite frightened, but after seeing their friend in this state, they hopped out of the car and ran to go help him without any hesitation. They would find him completely unconscious, laying motionless on the dark street. They tried to wake him up, but he was out cold. Not wanting to stick around, Maskey and Fordyce dragged their friend back to the car and laid him down in the back seat. Maskey hopped behind the steering wheel and sped towards the nearby Felixstowe Hospital, all while Fordyce tried to keep Johnson as comfortable as possible. Shortly after arriving, Johnson would wake back up, but he seemed to be suffering from amnesia, as he was completely unable to recognize the two friends that had just saved him. The doctors at this small hospital would come to the conclusion that Johnson must be in a state of extreme shock. Upon further examination, they would also find a strange burn mark on his neck as well as a bruise above his right ear. The doctors present felt that they may be under-equipped to deal with Johnson's psychological condition and his injuries, so they would soon transfer him to the larger Ipswich hospital. By the next day, it seems that he had regained his memories, and his friends would soon drive out to visit him. It was then that Johnson began to tell the doctors, reporters, and his friends exactly what happened to him in the woods next to Walden Avenue the night before. He would claim that when he suddenly got out of the car, it felt like he was being compelled to do so by an unknown force, which would then insist that he walk into the woods. He couldn't remember exactly how far he would walk into the darkness, but after just a little while, he would come face to face with a humanoid entity with large, sloping eyes that appeared to faintly glow. He would see this creature be engulfed by orange flames before he soon blacked out, unable to remember anything until waking up in the Ipswich hospital that morning. His two friends who had witnessed the flying oval craft themselves quickly came to believe him, knowing that strange things had happened out there that night. However, the doctors and the reporters from the Ipswich Evening Star were a bit more skeptical and weren't really sure what to make of this strange story. From here on out, the legend of the Felixstowe fire demon would circulate throughout the local area, before later spreading around the internet. Although now some think it was an extraterrestrial and others believe it was some kind of demon entity, the burn marks on Johnson's neck show that something truly strange happened that night. Dekelea Army Barracks Alien Encounter. In many encounters, the entities seen don't quite fit into any certain category, and are often thought of as both aliens and cryptid beasts at the same time. But in this largely forgotten case, the creature would be thought of as both a ghostly apparition and an extraterrestrial at the same time. This would all take place on the Dekelea Army Barracks and Base in Cyprus, back in September 1968. Around 3 in the morning, a non-commissioned officer from the British Army was awoken from the sound of his Turkish wolfhound growling loudly. Thinking that someone may be sneaking around the base, he got up and started to walk towards the door. As he did so, this large dog began to whimper and whine as it went to hide in a corner underneath the bed. It was then that the officer began to hear a high-pitched humming emanating from the other side of the door. He decided to go ahead and open it, quickly coming to see that the landing and the staircase leading down to the ground floor were all covered in an orange fiery light. As he looked down the staircase, he would immediately come to see a humanoid shape moving straight towards him. After a moment, he could see that this entity wore a blue one-piece outfit ending at the neck, had a plume of fire-red hair, bright orange skin, unblinking eyes, and was tilting forward with a large and hideous scowl on its face. As it cleared the top of the stairs, this officer started to become extremely frightened, noticing this person looked to be only half-formed, with the lower part of the body unable to be seen. This ghostly creature then rotated its head a full 180 degrees, looking behind it. At this moment, he began to panic and shot back into his room, closing the door behind him. Just a few seconds after this, the high-pitched humming sound seemed to grow even louder. Then he began to hear strange sliding sounds, which he believed to be coming from the entity as it moved closer to his room. Without thinking, this officer grabbed his spear gun and perched off the end of his bed, firing it straight at the closed door. The bolt went clean through without stopping, and then abruptly, the loud humming ceased and the orange light began to fade away. For the next hour, he sat in a state of shock in his room, unable to move, before a relief guard just happened to find him. Happy to see another real person, he told them the story, which was then quickly passed on to the commanding officer. He was then ordered to undergo a full medical and psychological profile. This ended up showing that he did indeed seem to have some temporary muscle paralysis, but was otherwise in good health. Although this man would choose to remain anonymous, he would go on to report this all to Jenny Randalls, who was the editor for the Northern UFO News at this time, and later investigator for Bufora. She's actually mainly the only reason this story is even known today. This officer never went on to seek any profit or fame from this encounter either, and was thought of as a reliable witness by those that knew him. Unfortunately though, it seems like this all caused his dog a bit of harm because he was said to react and bark at the slightest sound for the rest of his life. While talking about this case, it's almost hard not to mention another very similar case that happened just 8 years later. In 1976, out in Badajoz, Spain, 2 soldiers stationed at a guardhouse in the Talavera La Real Spanish Air Force Base would have an equally strange encounter. One night, a loud whistling sound and a bright light suddenly caught their attention. They were so noticeable that a third soldier ran over and began to sound an alarm. They all briefly searched around, but weren't having any luck finding out what the light and noise was coming from. They then quickly released a trained German Shepherd into the nearby bushes to search the surrounding area. But it was then that a blast of wind rushed across the 3 men and they heard a sound similar to branches breaking. The dog then began to stagger out of the shrubs. But following the dog was a very tall, ghostly apparition stretching nearly 9 feet off the ground. They said it appeared to be floating as the ends of its limbs looked to only be half-formed. They guessed that it may have even been made out of light as it emitted an odd green glow. The first soldier to approach this creature quickly fell to the ground in a paralyzed state, causing the other 2 to begin to fire their gun towards the entity in a panic. After about 50 rounds, the apparition suddenly vanished in a flash of light, while the whistling sound in the background died off shortly afterwards. The collapsed soldier soon woke up, suffering from a bit of vision loss and a headache, but soon went on to make a full recovery. This incident was then investigated, with none of the fired bullets or bullet holes ever being found. However, others at the base would confirm that they had heard the guns fire the night before. We may never know exactly what these creatures were, but many believed they could indeed be extraterrestrials. Many others believed it was some kind of ghostly apparition, and some even think they're multidimensional beings sharing the Earth alongside us. Whatever they are, they certainly don't seem to be human. But with that said, they don't necessarily seem hostile towards us either. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you liked it, be sure to leave a like and subscribe, as my channel's still small and I'll take all the support I can get. This is actually part of my iceberg series that I promise I will eventually compile and put all together. Be sure to check out some of the other parts of the iceberg I've made as well. Also, be sure to leave a comment, guys. I'm always interested in what you all have to say about these topics. I'll also mention that this show is also available on most podcast platforms if that's more your thing. For anyone wanting to show even more support, be sure to join my Patreon or channel membership, where you can get these videos early and ad-free. And an extra shout out to my Patreon supporters. Thank you guys. This was Matt, and I want to believe.